The low hum of the hallway light flickered above me as I stood outside the room where my wife whispered a lie she thought I'd never hear. Still, I kept my hand steady on the doorknob, letting that trembling bulb guide my breathing. As the flicker grew harsher, it lit the truth on her face, control disguised as prayer. While its cold stutter echoed, I realized it wasn't the light shaking, it was me waking up. The same glow showed the line between love and manipulation, far clearer than her words ever did. That's when I decided, justice begins in the quiet, right before you turn the handle. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Mike Henson wasn't supposed to be home yet. The August sun had barely dipped behind the pines when he turned his old pickup into the driveway, the cooler of trout still sloshing in the back. Fishing had been slow, quiet, exactly what he needed. But as he stepped onto the porch and unlocked the front door, something in the house felt off. Too still, too tense. He set his tackle box down gently, listening. At first he thought he imagined it, the faintest murmur drifting from upstairs like someone speaking through cupped hands. Then he heard it again. A voice. Low, urgent, not at all like prayer. Mike's heartbeat picked up. Hannah had told him she wanted to guide Jacob spiritually, but he assumed she meant simple prayer, not closed-door sessions, not whispering, not whatever this was. He climbed the stairs quietly, each step creaking under his weight. The murmuring grew clearer, words tumbling over each other, too fast to be peaceful. Then he recognized her voice. "Hannah, we're praying," she said sharply from the other side of the closed bedroom door, as if she sensed him standing there. "Give us privacy, Mike." Her tone wasn't annoyed, it was warning. A line drawn, a door slammed without being touched. Mike froze just short of the last step. He wasn't trying to interrupt anything holy, but something in how she said it clipped, defensive, knotted his stomach. He edged closer, close enough to hear the second voice. Jacob's voice, but it wasn't steady or spiritual. It was strained tight, like he was forcing words out through clenched teeth. Mike frowned. Jacob wasn't the type to get dramatic in prayer. Growing up, the kid had always whispered his prayers, almost shy with them. But this sounded like pressure, like fear wrapped in obedience. Before he could speak, a heavy thump hit the floor from inside the room. Mike instinctively reached for the doorknob. Another sound followed, Hannah's whisper, sharp as a hiss, a tone he'd rarely heard from her. It didn't sound like prayer. It didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like control. "Hannah," he said, knocking once, "what's going on in there?" No answer. He tried again, louder. "Jacob, you okay?" This time, Jacob's voice shot back immediately, too quickly. "Yeah, Dad, fine, just praying." Mike's chest tightened. Anyone who knew Jacob could hear the strain, the tremor he tried to hide. The kid always needed a second to formulate words when anxious, but this response had come like a reflex, a coached reflex. Mike lowered his voice. "Can I come in?" Suddenly the door cracked open just 2 inches, no more. Hannah filled the gap, her body angled sharply as though she were holding something back, or someone. Her hair stuck slightly to her forehead, and she forced a stiff smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mike," she said sweetly, too sweetly, "you're early." He tried peering around her shoulder, but she adjusted her stance, blocking the room completely. For a moment, he saw nothing behind her but dim light and the corner of Jacob's shadow on the floor. Hannah slipped her hand onto the door edge, tightening her grip. "Everything's fine," she added. "We're in the middle of something sacred." Mike swallowed. "I heard." "You heard a boy struggling with his spirit," she cut in. "Let us finish." He hesitated, staring at her face. Hannah wasn't flustered. She wasn't apologizing or embarrassed. She was composed, determined, as if she'd rehearsed this moment. Jacob didn't speak again. That silence bothered Mike most. Finally, Hannah offered a gentle but firm nod toward the stairs. "Go on, Mike. Dinner's in the fridge. We'll be down soon." She didn't wait for him to respond. She closed the door quietly but decisively, the latch clicking into place like a lock dropping on something far more than privacy. Mike stepped back slowly, the hairs on his arms rising. He wasn't a paranoid man. Never had been. He had worked with tools and ducks his whole life. He believed in what he could see, measure, fix. But there was nothing normal about that room, that whisper, that thump, or the way Jacob's voice broke at the edges. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the murmuring resumed upstairs, softer now yet somehow heavier. Hannah's voice rolled through the ceiling like a chant, but with an undercurrent he couldn't place. It made his chest tighten again, that same twisting dread he hadn't felt since losing his first wife. He opened the fridge but couldn't eat. His hands were trembling, something that hadn't happened in years. He kept replaying the fast reply, the blocked doorway, the forced smile. Something was wrong, not just wrong, hidden. Mike sat at the kitchen table, staring at the ceiling as the murmurs bled faintly through the vents. And as much as he tried to push it away, one thought kept clawing back, louder than the prayers upstairs. Whatever was happening in that room wasn't prayer. And for the first time in a long time, a seed of suspicion took root deep inside him, one he couldn't ignore anymore. Mike first heard the phrase on a Tuesday morning when sunlight was barely pushing through the kitchen blinds and Hannah was stirring her herbal tea with slow, deliberate circles. She spoke casually, as if announcing a dentist appointment. "Jacob needs deliverance sessions," she said, tapping the spoon against the rim. "Real spiritual work, the kind that goes deep." Mike froze mid-sip of his coffee. Deliverance, the word tasted wrong, heavy, overreaching. "He's dealing with depression, Hannah. He needs counseling, not." She cut him off with a wave of her hand. "You don't understand his spiritual battles. His mind is clouded. He needs freedom, and I'm helping him get it." Mike tried to ask what exactly these sessions involved, but she was already walking away, humming as if everything made perfect sense. But Jacob's face later that afternoon said otherwise. When Mike found him in the living room folding laundry, something he never did without prompting, he approached gently. "Hey, son, how are those sessions going?" Jacob stiffened like someone had touched a bruise. His eyes dropped instantly to the shirts in his hands. "They're fine, Dad," he muttered. "Helping, I guess." But he didn't look convinced, and he didn't look up, not once. Mike felt a cold ripple go down his spine. Avoidance was Jacob's tell. He had done it since he was a child. Whenever he was overwhelmed or scared, he couldn't meet a person's eyes for anything. And right now, he seemed glued to the floor. It didn't help that Pastor Caleb kept showing up at church with that wide, immaculate smile, praising Hannah at every turn. "Your wife has a gift," he'd tell Mike, gripping his shoulder with just a little too much pressure. "A real spiritual vessel. Jacob is fortunate to have her guidance." The compliment never felt like a compliment, more like a coded message, a reinforcement, a warning. Mike mentioned it in passing to Lydia one late afternoon while they both happened to be outside checking mail. She narrowed her eyes, arms crossing over her floral sweater. "Well, if you ask me," she said, leaning closer, "there's been a lot of late-night traffic outside your house lately. Cars pulling up around midnight. They don't stay long, maybe 20 minutes, but it's strange." That dialed every uneasy instinct inside Mike up another notch. Midnight visitors, delivered sessions, Hannah's rising authority. None of it fit into the quiet, predictable life he'd built with his son. He decided that night he'd join a prayer session. Whatever they were doing, he would at least witness it, understand it, protect Jacob if needed. But when he told Hannah after dinner, she reacted faster than he expected. Her spoon clattered against the table and she stood abruptly. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "You'll disrupt everything. You don't have the spiritual training for what I'm doing." Mike stared at her. "He's my son." She stared back, eyes narrowing with something colder than irritation, ownership. "And he needs healing, not interference." Jacob stayed silent through the entire exchange, shoulders drawing inward as if shrinking away from both of them. But his glance, quick, frightened, barely there, was enough. Mike caught it and it told him everything. Jacob didn't want to be left alone in those sessions. He just didn't know how to say it. Over the next few days, the house felt less like home and more like contested territory. Hannah began spending more time upstairs with Jacob behind that closed door. Mike would hear sermon recordings, then chanting, then silence. Long stretches of suffocating silence that made him think of that strained voice he'd heard before. Meals became tense. Paths through the house became divided. Hannah moved with purpose, claiming space and authority, while Jacob moved with hesitance, shoulders up, eyes down. And every time Mike approached the staircase, Hannah would appear suddenly, like she had been listening for his footsteps. "We're in session," she'd say curtly. "Respect the process." But respect wasn't what she was asking for. She wanted distance, isolation, control. Mike felt himself being pushed out inch by inch, breath by breath, until one evening he found him. Sitting alone in the backyard with his fishing knife, gripping it so tightly it left lines in his palm. This was his house, his family, his son, and somehow he was becoming a guest in all three. He took a long breath, looking up through the trees at the deepening Idaho sky. He remembered Jacob as a boy, quiet, gentle, following his father along rivers and workshops, never once afraid of him. And now this. Whatever was happening behind that door wasn't healing. It wasn't prayer. It was something else, something twisting Jacob in ways Mike couldn't yet see. And he realized, with a clarity that felt like a blade sliding into place, that if he didn't step in soon, he might lose his son entirely. So he made a vow right there under the darkening sky. He would find out exactly what Hannah was doing. He would uncover every shadow she hid behind. He would protect Jacob, no matter what it cost, even if it meant tearing apart the very foundation of his home. The house was supposed to be asleep. It was close to midnight, the kind of cold Idaho night where even the walls seemed to settle into silence. Mike had been lying in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for something, anything, that would make sense of the tension creeping through the house these days. He tried focusing on the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the faint rustle of pine branches outside the window. Then he heard it. A sound he would remember for the rest of his life. At first he thought it was just a cough or maybe a choked breath. But it came again, longer, sharper, breaking at the edges like something tearing from the inside. A cry, Jacob's cry, raw, painful, not the soft, stressed-out sniffles he'd heard from him before. This was deeper, a sound ripped out of him. Mike shot up in bed, heart slamming against his ribs. He didn't even put on shoes. He just ran through the hallway, up the stairs, following that sound. And as he got closer, he heard another voice layered over it. Hannah's voice. But it wasn't comforting. It wasn't soothing. It was commanding. Firm, harsh. "Let it out," she ordered. "Don't resist." The words froze him for a second. He'd never heard her speak like that. Not to Jacob, not to anyone. Then another sob crashed through the door, louder this time. A desperate, broken sound. That tore the hesitation out of Mike. He moved forward and slammed his fist against the closed bedroom door. Hannah opened the door. Silence followed for a beat. Then a violent rustling inside, and Hannah's voice snapped back at him, shrill and furious. "Leave. We're in the middle of a deliverance." Mike pounded harder. "He's crying, let me in." She screamed through the barrier. "You're interfering. Get away from the door." He didn't listen. He shoved his shoulder against the frame, banging again. "Jacob, son, talk to me." For a moment, nothing. Then a muffled voice, Jacob's, barely audible but trembling. "Dad, it's fine, I'm fine." No, he was. Mike knew that tone. He knew that lie. He'd heard it when Jacob was 10 and had been bullied at school. He'd heard it when Jacob's panic attacks first started after losing his mother. It was the same voice, the one that tried to protect everyone but himself. The doorknob clicked suddenly and the door cracked open just an inch. Hannah squeezed herself into the gap like she would bodily block him if she had to. Her hair was messy, her breathing uneven, but her eyes were blazing, not with fear, with anger. "I said leave," she hissed. "You're interrupting spiritual warfare." Before he could push past her, Jacob stumbled into view, pale, sweating, his shirt damp, his eyes red. He looked like someone who'd been emptied out from the inside. Mike reached out instinctively. "Jacob, what's going on? What did she—" "I'm okay," Jacob whispered, stepping back quickly as if afraid to get too close. "It's just part of the process." The process. The word twisted something deep inside Mike. He tried again, voice softer. "Did she hurt you? Just tell me." But Jacob shook his head rapidly. "No, no, Dad, I just needed it." Hannah placed a firm hand on Jacob's shoulder, squeezing just a little too tightly. "It's spiritual cleansing, Mike," she said with that calm, righteous tone she'd adopted lately. "The darkness fights back. You heard him, he's fine." Fine. There was nothing fine about the way Jacob's hands shook uncontrollably at his sides. Nothing fine about the way he flinched when Hannah touched him. But Hannah pushed the door closed before Mike could form another word. The latch clicked. Then a second click, she'd locked it. Mike stood there for a long moment, staring at the wood grain of the door as though it might open again if he just willed it hard enough. But the house fell quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that hides things. He walked slowly down the stairs, his legs heavy, his mind spiraling. He didn't even attempt going back to bed. Instead, he sank onto the couch, the leather cold beneath him. He listened to the refrigerator hum, the clock tick, the floor occasionally pop. Ordinary sounds in an unordinary night, but none of them drowned out the cry he'd heard. A father knows his child's real voice, and Jacob's had been nothing but pain. He lay there until sleep finally overtook him like a heavy fog, thin, fractured sleep, filled with echoes of Jacob's sobs. Morning came with pale light and footsteps on the stairs. Jacob appeared first, holding his mug with both hands as if anchoring himself. "Dad," he said softly, "I'm sorry about last night. It got intense." Mike studied him. The apology sounded rehearsed. His smile was forced, his eyes haunted. More haunted than any morning should ever make a young man look. And in that expression, Mike saw the truth Jacob wouldn't say out loud. Something was deeply wrong. Something no prayer should cause. And whatever had happened behind that door, it wasn't over. Mike found Jacob on the back porch that afternoon, sitting on the old wooden steps with his elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. The late summer air hung thick and warm around them, but Jacob looked cold, shoulders tense, fingers clasped so tight his knuckles were white. Mike approached quietly, not wanting to startle him. "Son," he said softly, "you didn't sleep last night. Talk to me." Jacob's breath hitched. He didn't look up. "Dad, I don't want to do the sessions anymore." The words came out flat at first, but there was a tremor underneath, almost like his voice was splitting in half. Mike sat beside him, careful not to crowd him. "Then don't," he said, trying to keep calm. "You don't have to do anything that scares you." Jacob swallowed hard. "It's not that simple." Before Mike could ask why, the porch door creaked open behind them. Hannah. She stood framed in the doorway like a shadow cutting across the fading light. Her expression was unreadable, eyes flat, mouth pressed in a thin, straight line. "What's not simple?" she asked. Jacob stiffened instantly. Mike felt him shrink inward, like a child caught doing something wrong. He hated seeing that fear in his son. Jacob tried to speak, but Hannah stepped closer, her voice soft and icy. "I hope you're not saying what I think you're saying." I don't want more sessions," Jacob whispered. The transformation was instant. Hannah's entire face hardened, a coldness settling into her features that made Mike's chest tighten. "You don't get to walk away from spiritual work because it's uncomfortable," she said. If you resist, you're opening yourself to consequences, serious ones. Jacob flinched like she'd struck him. Mike's protective instinct surged so strong he had to fight the urge to stand up between them. "Enough, Hannah," he snapped. "He said he doesn't want it. That's the end of it." She turned her head toward him slowly, her expression shifting into something colder, sharper. "You wouldn't understand. You've never understood spiritual warfare." "I understand fear," Mike shot back, "and he's scared." Hannah stared at Jacob for a long moment, her silence almost worse than her words. Finally, she turned and walked back inside, but the tension she left behind clung to the air like smoke. Jacob's shoulders slumped, and his breath left him in a shaky exhale. "She's not going to let me stop," he said softly. Mike placed a steady hand on his back. "She doesn't get to decide that." But Jacob didn't look convinced. The next day, Pastor Caleb showed up at the Hinson doorstep unannounced. No call, no warning, just his polished shoes on the welcome mat and that calm, authoritative smile that always felt too practiced. "Is Hannah home?" he asked, already stepping inside. Mike blocked the doorway with his body. "What's this about?" Caleb clasped his hands behind his back, his voice warm but coated with something oily. "Hannah told me Jacob is resisting the deliverance work. It happens often when the devil senses he's losing ground." Mike felt his jaw tighten. "He's not resisting, he's saying no." Caleb chuckled lightly, like Mike had made a childish mistake. "That's the same thing, brother. The darkness pushes back hardest right before breakthrough." "I'm not your brother," Mike snapped, "and Jacob is not your project." Caleb tilted his head, regarding Mike with a smile so condescending it made Mike's skin crawl. "You're being emotional. I understand. It's difficult watching someone heal in ways you don't relate to." "Boundaries," Mike said firmly. "There need to be boundaries. No more showing up without calling. No more closed-door sessions in my house. And no more pressuring Jacob." Caleb didn't argue. He didn't even blink. He simply smiled wider, as if Mike had said something amusingly naive. "Spiritual healing doesn't pause for comfort, Mike, but we'll pray for your clarity." Mike almost slammed the door in his face, but he didn't. Something in Caleb's expression told him this man fed off conflict, and Mike wouldn't give him tea. Had satisfaction. He simply closed the door slowly, deliberately. Inside, Jacob stood in the hallway, pale as chalk. "He heard us," Jacob whispered. "She told him everything." Mike pulled in a long, shaky breath. "Don't worry, son, I'm handling it." But later that evening, when Hannah mentioned prayer again, just the word, nothing more, Jacob began shaking so violently he had to grip the back of a chair to steady himself. His eyes went distant, almost glassy, and Mike felt something inside him break. This wasn't spiritual healing. This was trauma forming in real time. After Jacob went upstairs, Mike sat at the kitchen table with his old carpenter's notebook and began writing everything down. Dates, times, words said, physical reactions, Hannah's threats, Caleb's intrusion, Jacob's trembling. Every detail. He didn't know exactly what he would do with the information yet, but he knew deep in his bones that he was going to need it, that something was building, moving, escalating. And tonight, as the house settled into another uneasy silence, Mike realized he no longer trusted his own home to keep his son safe. The nights ahead were only getting darker. Mike wasn't expecting a knock that morning. He'd barely poured his first cup of coffee when he heard it, 3 short taps, followed by a pause, then one more. Lydia's knock. She always tapped like she didn't want to disturb the house but needed to be heard anyway. When he opened the door, she stood on the porch in a windbreaker, hair pinned up, eyes sharper than usual. "Mike, I need to show you something," she whispered, glancing over his shoulder as if Hannah might appear at any second. He stepped aside. "Come in." But she shook her head. "No, not here, my place." That alone made his stomach tighten. Lydia was bold, unfiltered, unafraid of speaking her mind. But today she seemed cautious, on edge. She led him across the lawn, shut her own door quietly behind them, and walked straight to her small living room where a laptop sat open on the coffee table. "I should have told you earlier," she murmured, lowering herself into her recliner. "I've had a door camera installed for a while. Faces your hallway window." Mike blinked. "Lydia, why?" "Because," she said, meeting his eyes, "your house hasn't sounded right for months, and last week it sounded wrong." His pulse quickened. "What did you record?" She turned the laptop toward him and hit play. The screen lit up with a grainy nighttime view of the upstairs hallway inside his house, the angle unmistakable. Hannah must have left the hallway window cracked open. Lydia's camera had picked up everything through that narrow gap. The first clip began at 10:48 p.m. Hannah appeared in the frame, one hand clamped around Jacob's wrist, pulling him down the hallway. Not guiding, not leading, dragging. His body resisted, legs bending awkwardly as he tried to stop, his free hand bracing against the wall. His voice wasn't audible yet, but his posture, God, his posture said enough. Hannah yanked the bedroom door open with startling force and shoved him inside. Then she stepped in after him and slammed the door so hard the hallway picture frame trembled. Mike felt the blood drain from his face. Lydia paused the video, her voice gentle but firm. "There's more." The second clip started at 11:57 p.m. A shadow moved along the side of the house, then a figure appeared at the back door. Pastor Caleb. He didn't knock, he didn't call. He simply let himself in like he'd done it 100 times. Mike leaned back slowly, breath shallow. "What the hell?" "You haven't seen the worst," Lydia said quietly. She clicked again. Audio kicked in this time, muffled but unmistakable. Jacob's voice, crying hard, "Stop, please stop." Mike's entire body went cold. It wasn't resistance. It wasn't prayer. It was fear, pure fear. Hannah's voice followed, sharp and commanding. "Jacob, don't fight it. Do you want to stay broken? Do you want demons tearing into your mind? Let it out." Then another noise, a thump. Not the kind Mike had heard by accident before. This one was heavy, intentional, the kind that made his gut twist. He wanted to shut the laptop. He wanted to stop the footage, stop the sounds, stop every horrible confirmation slamming into him. But he couldn't. He had to know. He had to see. The final clip began at 12:32 a.m. The bedroom door opened. Hannah stepped out first, hair disheveled, breathing hard. Jacob stumbled behind her, eyes swollen, tears streaking down his face. His hands trembled violently. Hannah held a stack of papers and a pen. "Sign it," she ordered. Jacob didn't move. Hannah stepped closer, her voice lowering into that same cold tone Mike had heard days earlier. "If you don't sign, the sessions get worse. Do you understand me?" Jacob broke. His shoulders collapsed inward and he nodded barely. He took the pen with shaking fingers and scribbled something. Hannah snatched the papers from him, tucked them into a folder and pushed him into the bedroom. The audio cut and the clip ended. Mike didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat had closed around a fist-sized lump of disbelief and sickness. "Mike," Lydia said softly, "I don't know what those papers were, but he wasn't doing that willingly." He stared at the frozen final frame on the screen, Hannah's back blocking the door, Jacob nearly folded in on himself. The picture felt like a punch, a confirmation of everything he feared but wasn't ready to believe. This wasn't spiritual anything. This wasn't healing. This wasn't a mother guiding her stepson. This was control, manipulation, psychological violence wrapped in scripture. Mike pressed a hand over his mouth as the truth crashed into him like a wave he couldn't brace for. "My God," he whispered, "she's breaking him." Lydia reached across the table, touching his arm lightly. "You needed to see this. You needed proof." He nodded slowly, eyes locked on the laptop. Proof. That word hit him hard. Because now, with this footage burned into his memory, Mike understood one thing with painful, brutal clarity. Jacob wasn't being prayed for. He was being held under someone else's will, piece by piece, night after night. And Mike wasn't going to stand by another second. Something had to change. Something had to start. Mike waited until Jacob was alone, really alone. Not in the hallway, not within earshot of Hannah's hovering presence. He found him in the garage late that evening, sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the concrete floor as though answers might rise from the cracks. The dim yellow bulb above them flickered, throwing soft shadows across Jacob's exhausted face. "Son," Mike began gently, keeping his voice steady, "I need to talk to you about something I've seen." Jacob's shoulders jerked, not a flinch, an instinctive recoil like someone expecting a blow. "Dad, please, not now." But Mike stepped closer, lowering himself to eye level. "I saw footage. Lydia showed me what she recorded from the hallway window." Jacob's breath stopped. His eyes wide, terrified, shot up to meet his father's. "Dad, you're not supposed to." "I saw Hannah dragging you. I heard you crying." His voice trembled despite his effort to stay calm. "That wasn't prayer. That wasn't deliverance. That was abuse." "No," Jacob whispered, shaking his head so fast it looked involuntary. "Please don't call it that. If she finds out you saw Dad, she'll think I betrayed her. She'll think I'm resisting again." "Jacob," Mike said, the words strained with equal parts anger and heartbreak, "you don't owe her fear." But Jacob was already breathing too fast, panic rising like a tide. "You don't understand what she says will happen if I stop. She says the attacks will come back. Worse. She says the devil punishes people who walk away halfway." Mike felt heat climb up his spine, anger, the kind he hadn't felt since his contracting days when someone tried to cheat him out of a paycheck. But this was worse. This was his son, terrified of the woman he lived with. Before Mike could answer, the garage door opened. Hannah's silhouette cut across the floor. She didn't ask what they were talking about. She didn't have to. Her eyes found Jacob's trembling hands, then darted to Mike's clenched jaw. "So," she said coolly, "you've been poisoning him against me." Jacob immediately shrank back, as if her voice alone pulled strings tied to his spine. "Hannah," Mike said carefully, "this has gone far enough. You're hurting him." Her laugh was low, humorless. "Hurting him? You're jealous, Mike, spiritually jealous. You hate that I can reach him in ways you can't." She stepped closer, her presence suffocating the small garage. "You resent that God is using me." Mike stared at her, almost stunned. "This is God, Hannah, this is control." For a moment, something venomous crossed her face, but she hid it quickly behind a pious smile. "Poor thing," she said softly, shaking her head. "You're blind, and you're standing in the way of your son's healing." The next Sunday, Mike got his answer about where her confidence came from. Pastor Caleb stood at the pulpit with his perfect posture and unnervingly calm expression. The sermon was titled "Obedience in the Household." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Mike a moment longer than coincidence allowed. "There are husbands," he said, "who resist their wives' spiritual gifts, men who fear losing control." His voice was syrup-thick, dripping sanctimony. "These men hinder deliverance. They open doors to darkness through their rebellion." A few heads turned toward Mike. Caleb let the silence stretch, letting the implication settle like dust. Mike crossed his arms, jaw tight. He had no doubts anymore. Caleb wasn't preaching doctrine. He was sending a message. Over the next few days, Jacob began disappearing. Hours at a time, no explanation, no texts returned. He'd leave the house pale and return paler, exhausted, disoriented. He barely spoke, barely ate, and every time Hannah mentioned the word prayer, Jacob's hands started shaking the same way they had in the footage. Mike felt something inside him snap. This wasn't family conflict. This wasn't spiritual disagreement. This was the slow dismantling of his son's mind. So he picked up the phone, and called Detective Nora Briggs. She answered on the third ring. "Briggs." "It's Mike Henson," he said, voice low. "I need to report something. Something's happening to my son." He explained the late-night sessions, the crying, the footage Lydia captured, the coercion, the threats disguised as faith. Briggs didn't interrupt. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted, no longer neutral but alert. "Mike," she said, "what you're describing sounds like manipulation and possible coercive abuse, but I need more before I can intervene formally. Keep documenting. Dates, times, what you see, what you hear, anything that confirms patterns." More documentation, more waiting. Mike hung up, staring at the silent house through the kitchen window, the house where his son was being broken piece by piece under the guise of salvation. It hit him then with brutal clarity. This wasn't a marriage issue, wasn't a parenting dispute, wasn't a church misunderstanding. It was a system, a controlled loop, a cult-like manipulation burrowed deep into his own home. And if he didn't pull Jacob out soon, they were going to lose him. Mike hadn't meant to go through Jacob's backpack. He wasn't that kind of father. But that morning the bag sat half unzipped on the kitchen chair, sagging open like it was begging for someone to notice what was inside. And after the week they'd had, the shaking, the disappearances, the terror in Jacob's eyes, Mike couldn't ignore his instincts anymore. He reached for the bag slowly, almost hoping he wouldn't find anything. But beneath a half-empty water bottle and a wrinkled hoodie he saw it, a folder, thick, too formal to be schoolwork or medical forms. He pulled it out and flipped it open. His heart stopped. The first page wasn't typed. It was handwritten in Hannah's looping, confident script. Temporary transfer of financial authority and power of attorney. Mike scanned the page, blood draining from his face. All savings and current accounts shall be made accessible to Hannah Henson until spiritual healing is complete. To prevent demonic interference in decision-making. Full surrender required for deliverance. He gripped the edges of the paper, so hard it crinkled under his fingers. No. No, this couldn't be real. Not Jacob, not his money, not his freedom. He flipped to the next page and his stomach lurched. Jacob's signature, shaking, uneven, barely legible, sat at the bottom. Beneath it, in bold ink, the witness signature. Pastor Caleb Grant. Mike sat down heavily at the table, the document trembling in his hands. This wasn't spiritual manipulation anymore. This was financial, legal, calculated. And it wasn't accidental, it was orchestrated. He heard the stairs creak and looked up to see Jacob standing in the doorway, pale and exhausted, wearing the same clothes he'd slept in. "Jacob," Mike said quietly, "what is this?" Jacob froze. His eyes flicked to the papers and he swallowed hard. "Dad, don't get angry." "How could I not get angry?" Mike's voice cracked. "This gives her control over your money, your decisions, your entire life." Jacob looked down at the floor, arms wrapped tightly around himself. "She said I needed to. She said the grief, the stuff from Mom, that it opened doors, that I was possessed by it, that I was too vulnerable to make choices without spiritual oversight." Possessed by grief. Mike felt the words cut deep, deeper than he expected. Jacob had been 12 when his mother died. He'd carried that loss like a shadow for years, but to weaponize it, to use it as leverage. "Hannah told me," Jacob continued tremulously, "that surrender is part of deliverance, total surrender. She said money is one of the devil's favorite footholds. She said if I didn't sign, my healing would never happen, and I'd drag both of you into darkness with me." Mike pressed his fists against the table to steady himself. "Jacob, she lied to you." Jacob flinched as if the statement itself hurt. "But Caleb said." "Caleb," Mike cut in sharply, "is not God." Jacob's breath hitched, and for the first time he looked up, eyes swollen, scared, desperate. "Dad, I didn't want to sign. I really didn't. But she kept saying I wasn't fighting hard enough. that I was choosing the demon of grief over freedom. I just wanted the pressure to stop. Mike took a slow breath, trying to calm the storm raging through him. He stood up, walked around the table, and placed a steady hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You're not possessed, Jacob. You're hurting, and she's exploiting that hurt." Jacob's chin trembled, but he didn't pull away. Mike folded the papers, grabbed his keys, and said firmly, "I'm taking this to someone who can help." Wyatt Clark's office smelled like old books and strong coffee, the same mix it had smelled like 20 years ago when Wyatt handled the legal mess after Mike's first wife passed. Wyatt looked older now, his hair more gray than silver, but his eyes were still sharp. He took the papers, adjusted his glasses, and started reading. With each line, his jaw tightened. By the time he finished, he exhaled slowly, the way a man does when he has to choose his words carefully. "Mike, this isn't spiritual guidance. This is financial exploitation, coercion, at minimum." Mike pressed both hands against his thighs. "Can she enforce any of this?" Wyatt tapped the signature line. "Not legally, not if the signature was obtained under pressure. But this," he held up the top page, "is a warning sign of intent. She's positioning herself for control over your son's assets, and with Caleb as a witness, it looks like collusion." "Criminal?" Mike asked. Wyatt nodded once. "Possibly, especially if we can prove emotional manipulation, undue influence, or restricted autonomy." Mike leaned back, heart pounding. He knew Hannah was unstable. He knew she was controlling. But this was a map of her endgame. Wyatt set the papers down gently. "You're going to need more evidence, Mike. Keep documenting, keep saving everything, and don't confront her yet. Not until we know exactly what we're dealing with." Mike nodded slowly, fists tightening at his sides. Because now he knew exactly what Hannah was after. And he knew the fight was just beginning. The screams started like distant echoes, faint, distorted, the kind of noise a house makes when settling after midnight. Mike was half asleep on the couch, the living room lit only by the dim glow of the street lamp bleeding through tea. He curtains. For a moment he thought he'd imagined it. Then the second scream tore through the air, clear, raw, unrestrained. "Jacob!" Mike bolted upright, his pulse exploding in his chest. A crash followed, something heavy hitting the floor upstairs. Then another, the kind of impact that didn't come from prayer or deliverance. It came from violence. He sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time. As he reached the hallway, Jacob's voice cracked through the door, high, broken, panicked. "Stop, please stop." Mike's heart slammed against his ribs. He grabbed the doorknob, locked. Inside, Hannah's voice rose, sharp and furious. "Resist the demon, resist it." Another crash. Something metallic bounced across the floor. Jacob screamed again, a sound so primal it cut Mike clean through. He slammed his fist against the door. "HANNAH, open this door right now." No answer. He pounded harder. "Jacob, I'm here, hold on." But all he heard next was sobbing, the kind that shakes a person so deeply it scrapes the soul. "No more," Jacob cried. "Please, I can't." Mike snapped. He stepped back, braced himself, and drove his shoulder into the door with every ounce of force he had left in his 68-year-old body. Pain shot through him, but the door didn't budge. He rammed it again, growling through clenched teeth. Inside, Hannah shouted something he couldn't make out. Panic rose in his throat. He took 3 quick steps back, then hurled his weight forward. This time, wood splintered. The lock tore loose from the frame. The door flew open. The scene inside froze him for half a second, just long enough for horror to take root. Jacob lay on the floor, curled in on himself, shaking violently as if a current were running through his veins. His face was wet with tears, his breath shallow, chest heaving like he couldn't get enough air. A lamp lay shattered beside him, pieces glittering across the carpet. And standing over him, blocking him, was Pastor Caleb. Caleb held his arm out like a barrier. Do not interfere, Mike. This is the holy climax of deliverance. You're interrupting God's work. Mike saw red. Move, he growled. Caleb didn't. His expression was cold, controlled, almost triumphant. If you get involved now, he may never be free. Mike shoved him hard. Caleb stumbled backward, hitting the dresser with a thud. Hannah rushed forward, eyes blazing. "How dare you?" she screamed. "You're destroying everything." Mike dropped to his knees beside Jacob. "Son, look at me. You're okay, I'm here." Jacob blinked through the tears, his voice trembling. "Dad, it hurts. Please don't let them." "I won't," Mike whispered fiercely. "Not again." Hannah spun toward the hall, grabbing her phone. "I'm calling the police. You assaulted a pastor. You barged into a sacred session." Mike didn't even look up. His focus stayed locked on Jacob, on the terror in his son's eyes, the tremors running through his body like aftershocks. "Hannah," he warned, "put the phone down." She didn't. She dialed, her voice rising into hysterics as she shouted into the receiver, "He attacked U.S. My husband is out of control. Send officers now." Caleb straightened his shirt, regaining his composure with a smugness that turned Mike's stomach. "You've crossed a line you can't undo." Minutes later, though it felt like seconds, footsteps thundered up the stairs. Two officers stormed into the hallway, hands on their tasers. Hannah pointed dramatically at Mike. He burst in, he threw Caleb, "He's dangerous." Caleb nodded solemnly, playing the wounded saint. "I was only trying to help the boy." Mike clenched his jaw. He wanted to scream the truth. He wanted to show them the bruises, the terror, the shaking. But Jacob was too weak to speak, his breath still coming short, his hands still trembling. The officers moved in. "Sir," one said firmly, "turn around. Hands behind your back." Mike lifted his palms slowly, trying to stay calm. "My son is in danger. You need to look at him. Look at what they've been doing." "Sir," the officer repeated stronger, "turn around, now." Mike closed his eyes, chest heavy, rage boiling beneath the surface. He lowered his hands behind him as cold metal cuffs snapped into place around his wrists. As they pulled him toward the hallway, Jacob lurched forward, reaching for him with shaking arms. "Dad," he gasped. "Dad, don't leave me, please don't leave me." His voice broke, his hand dropped. And the last thing Mike saw before they dragged him downstairs was his son collapsing back to the floor, alone, trembling in the center of the room Hannah called holy. The flashing red and blue lights painted the living room walls as the officers led Mike inside. His wrists still stung from the cuffs, and the sting worsened when he saw Hannah standing there, arms folded, chin lifted, playing the role of the wounded saint. "He attacked me," she said the moment the officers guided Mike toward the couch. Her voice trembled in just the right places. "He burst into our prayer hour. Screaming, shoving, disrupting a sacred session. He put his hands on me." Mike stared at her, disbelief colliding with fury. "I didn't touch you, Hannah. You were hurting Jacob. I broke the door because he was screaming." But Hannah shook her head slowly, as if heartbroken that he would lie. "He's dangerous," she whispered to the officers. "He's unstable. He's been jealous of my spiritual connection to Jacob for months." Mike barked out a humorless laugh. "Jealous? You're destroying him." Before he could say more, Caleb stepped forward from the hallway, hands folded, demeanor calm, expression dripping with false piety. "Officers," he said softly, "I witnessed the entire thing. Mike came into the room violent, shouting, shoving me aside. Hannah tried calming him, but he became enraged." The officer closest to Mike turned. "Sir, do you deny you pushed this man?" Mike stared at Caleb, at the serene smile, the lowered gaze, the practiced holiness. "I pushed him because he was blocking me from reaching my son who was crying on the floor. I was protecting Jacob." Caleb sighed dramatically. "He's delusional, God help him." The casual cruelty in those words almost made Mike lunge forward. The officers stepped in immediately. "Sit down," one ordered. Jacob appeared at the top of the stairs then, small, shaking, his hand on the banister to steady himself. His face was pale, eyes red from crying, and when he looked at Mike, something inside him broke again. "Jacob," Mike said, voice softer, "tell them." Hannah turned sharply. "Jacob, stay upstairs." Jacob froze mid-step. His eyes darted between them, toward Mike, toward Hannah, toward Caleb. His breath trembled. His lips parted, but no words came out. "Tell them what happened," Mike begged quietly. Jacob's voice finally slipped forward, thin as thread. I can't." It wasn't defiance. It was fear, paralyzing, bone-deep fear. Hannah nodded at the officers with an expression of righteous grief. "You see, he's traumatized. This man," she pointed directly at Mike, "is the cause." One of the officers stepped behind Mike. "Sir, you're under arrest for domestic disturbance and assault." Mike didn't resist this time. He closed his eyes as the cuffs clicked back into place, the weight of them symbolic, like shackles not just on his wrists, but on his ability to protect his son. Jacob's voice cracked again from the top of the stairs. "Dad." But Hannah stepped in front of him, blocking his view. "Go to your room, Jacob. You need prayer." Jacob flinched at the word prayer, his hand slipping off the banister. The officers guided Mike outside, down the steps, into the cold night air. The house glowed behind him like a stage set of lies and manipulation. They placed him in the patrol car. As the engine started, the door closed, and the world outside turned to blurred streaks of red and blue. Mike felt something burn through him. Not defeat, but something darker and more focused. The holding cell smelled like bleach and stale coffee. The cot was thin, the walls cold, and the hum of a distant fluorescent light drilled into his skull. Mike sat there, elbows on his knees, replaying every second of the night. Jacob screaming. Hannah shouting about demons. Caleb blocking the door. The officers believing the wrong people. He had never felt so powerless. Hours crawled by before he finally heard footsteps approach. A key rattled in the lock. Wyatt Clark stepped inside, coat still half-buttoned, hair disheveled, jaw clenched tight. He looked like a man who left his bed the moment he got the call. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mike," he said, voice low and furious, "they're setting you up." Mike exhaled shakily. "I know." Wyatt set a folder on the bench beside him. "Hannah claims you barged into the room and attacked her. Caleb backs her story. They're calling it a domestic assault rooted in spiritual animosity." He scoffed. Hell of a phrase to use when they're the ones running a cult. Mike rubbed his face. "Jacob's too scared to speak. They've got him trapped." Wyatt nodded grimly. "That's exactly why they're doing this. If they discredit you, they get more control over him. And that paperwork you brought me, they're building a case to isolate him legally." Mike felt a slow-burning rage gather beneath his ribs, solid, steady, unyielding. Wyatt pulled out the arrest report. "Briggs is reviewing this. She told me it doesn't add up." That sparked something inside Mike. Hope. Small but sharp. "She believes me?" Mike asked. Wyatt nodded. "She says the story's off, too clean, too rehearsed, and she's already flagged your situation as suspicious." Mike leaned back against the cold wall. "Good, because I'm not letting them take Jacob. I'm not letting them break him any further." Wyatt studied his face. "Mike, this won't be simple." "I don't want simple," Mike said quietly. "I want the truth exposed." He lifted his head, eyes steady, jaw set. "They want a war," he whispered. "Fine. I'll give them one." Detective Nora Briggs wasn't the type to rush anything. She was methodical, steady, and quietly relentless, the kind of investigator who could take apart a lie the same way a surgeon separates tissue from bone. And when she received the call from Wyatt about Mike's arrest, something in her instincts refused to sit still. By noon the next day, she knocked on Lydia Power's door. Lydia, who had already seen Mike taken away in handcuffs, didn't hesitate. She ushered Briggs inside and walked straight toward the same laptop she'd shown Mike. "I knew this wasn't over," she said, hands shaking slightly as she opened the file directory. "You need to hear what's on this." Briggs leaned in, pulling out her departmental headphones. Her expression didn't change as Lydia clicked play, but her posture sharpened, shoulders drawing tight. The audio began with faint footsteps, then Hannah's voice, too sharp to be motherly, too forceful to be pastoral. "Breathe faster, Jacob. They need to hear struggle. Deliverance only works when the demon reacts." Briggs' jaw twitched. Then Caleb's voice entered, smooth, practiced, clinical. "Good, now tremble your hands, Jacob, focus. If you want healing, you must allow us to guide the reactions. Don't hold back, show fear." Jacob's voice came through next, soft, wavering, achingly reluctant. Do I have to sound scared?" "Yes," Hannah snapped. "And louder. They need to hear it, Jacob. God needs to hear it." Then on the recording, Caleb added, "Your father must believe you're fighting something dark. It's the only way he'll stop interfering." Briggs paused the audio and sat back, eyes narrowing. "That's staged abuse," she said quietly. "Manufactured emotional trauma." Lydia nodded. "Keep listening." Briggs hit play again. Another segment, this one filled with muffled crying. Not theatrical, not staged, real crying. The kind that came from a breaking point. Hannah's voice continued relentlessly. "Good, that's what repentance sounds like. Let it sound like pain. Pain is holy." Briggs' expression finally cracked, anger sliding in like a storm cloud. She took out her notebook. "I need a copy of everything, raw files, dates, and times." Lydia had already prepared a flash drive. "I figured you'd want them." Back at the station, Briggs sat alone in her small office, door closed, blinds half drawn. She played the recordings again, noting timestamps, overlapping voices, Jacob's escalating distress. And then she synced the audio with Mike's earlier account. It aligned too well. Too perfectly. She opened the file Wyatt had sent, the document Jacob had been forced to sign. Her eyes locked on the phrasing. "Until spiritual healing is complete." Authority transferred to Hannah Henson. Witnessed by Pastor Caleb Grant. Her pen circled the key lines. Coercive control. Financial leverage. Abuse masked in religious language. Then she ran Caleb Grant's name through the financial crimes database. It took less than a minute to surface something suspicious. Recurring deposits from multiple church members, all labeled. Healing session contributions. Deliverance work. Briggs scrolled deeper. The amounts made her eyebrows lift. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars, all funneled through personal accounts rather than church-led ones. This was business. Not faith. And not legal. She tapped her keyboard harder now, voice low and measured. "This isn't spiritual leadership, this is extortion." She drove straight to the Henson home. When Hannah opened the door, her faux serenity flickered for just 1 second, like a candle hit by sudden wind. "Detective," she said sweetly, "I assume you're here to talk about my husband's violent behavior." Briggs didn't bother with pleasantries. She stepped inside. "Where's Jacob?" Hannah's smile tightened. "Resting, recovering spiritually. You shouldn't interrupt." "I'm not asking permission," Briggs cut in, walking past her. She found Jacob sitting at the dining table, shoulders hunched, eyes dull. He looked like a man half-rooted in someone else's nightmare. "Jacob," Briggs said softly, pulling out a chair, "I listened to the recordings." His breath caught. His fingers tightened around the sleeve of his shirt. Briggs continued, "I heard them coaching you to fake reactions. I heard you crying. I know what they've been making you do." Jacob's eyes filled instantly. No hesitation, no denial left in him. The dam cracked. "I just wanted peace," he whispered, voice breaking. "They promised me peace." Briggs leaned forward. Jacob, what they did to you wasn't prayer, it wasn't healing, it was manipulation, and it was criminal. Jacob's shoulders shook as the truth broke through him. For once, he didn't look over his shoulder for Hannah's reaction. He just cried. Hannah appeared behind Briggs then, voice sharp. "Detective, you have no right." Briggs stood and faced her squarely. "Hannah Henson, you and Pastor Caleb Grant are now subjects of an active investigation, coercive abuse, financial exploitation, and religious manipulation." Hannah's eyes widened. "You can't." "I can," Briggs said firmly, "and I am." She turned toward the door. "You'll both be contacted for formal interviews. Until then, do not attempt any more sessions with Jacob. If you do, you'll be arrested." Hannah's mask slipped entirely, rage twisting her features in a way Briggs had expected but still found chilling. But Briggs didn't stop. On her way out, she made one final note, her voice low, unwavering. "This investigation starts today." As Briggs drove away, she glanced at the flash drive resting on her passenger seat. Solid, conclusive proof. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And for the first time in weeks, Mike and Jacob finally had someone fighting on their side. The morning after Briggs opened the investigation, Wyatt moved faster than Mike had ever seen him move. The man usually worked with the slow, methodical confidence of someone who'd handled every legal mess in Boise for 3 decades. But today, he came into his office with his sleeves rolled up and a stack of documents already waiting. "Mike," he said, not even sitting down, "we're filing for an emergency protective order for Jacob. Today." Mike nodded, the weight of the last weeks pressing into his shoulders, but for the first time there was a flicker, just a flicker, of hope. Wyatt drafted everything with razor precision. The footage Lydia captured, the audio Briggs reviewed, the coercive contract, the arrest, the false statements. Every detail went into the request. "This isn't just protection," Wyatt said, signing the final page. "It's firepower. If the judge grants this, Hannah and Caleb won't be able to touch Jacob." And within hours they got it. That afternoon, a sheriff's deputy walked up the Henson driveway with an envelope in his hand. Hannah was outside trimming roses, pretending as if life were normal, humming some hymn as though nothing had cracked beneath her perfectly curated surface. "Mrs. Henson," the deputy said. She turned with that practiced, gentle smile. "Yes." He handed her the envelope. "You've been served." Her smile faltered before she even opened it, but when she did, when her eyes hit the heading Emergency Protective Order, her entire face contorted, not with sadness, not with confusion, with pure, unfiltered rage. "What is this?" she demanded, voice rising. "It prevents you and Pastor Grant from having contact with Jacob Henson," the deputy said calmly. "Effective immediately." "You have no idea what you're disrupting," she snapped. "You're interfering with God's work." The deputy didn't move. "Ma'am, you need to stay at least 300 feet away from him." Hannah looked toward the house as if Jacob might be watching. Her eyes darkened. Her mask finally, undeniably, cracked open, revealing the fury and control she'd kept hidden behind scripture and soft smiles. "This is his father's doing," she hissed. "He's poisoning Jacob, destroying everything we've built." But for the first time, none of her anger meant anything. The law had spoken. And she wasn't the one in power anymore. Caleb showed up at the police station shortly after, demanding to see Briggs. He barged into the lobby like a man accustomed to authority bending around him. "I want to speak to Detective Briggs," he said sharply. "Now." Briggs stepped out from the hallway, her expression steady, professional. "Pastor Grant." Caleb stepped forward, lowering his voice into that deep, sermon-like tone. "You're overstepping. This is a spiritual matter. You don't understand deliverance or sacrifice or what that boy needs. You should stop before you put yourself in the middle of something you cannot comprehend." Briggs didn't blink. "Are you trying to intimidate me, Pastor?" "I'm trying to warn you," he said, leaning in. "People who interfere with God's work tend to suffer consequences." Briggs lifted one eyebrow. "Financial consequences, legal consequences, because that's the kind of work you're doing according to your bank records." Caleb's jaw tightened. Briggs continued, "This investigation is active, and your behavior today only reinforces the red flags. Leave now." He stared at her, expression wavering between indignation and panic. He wasn't used to losing control. He wasn't used to losing influence. And right now, he was losing both. Finally, he turned sharply and walked out. Briggs watched him go, knowing full well they had just seen the beginning, not the peak, of his unraveling. With the protective order in place, Mike brought Jacob home from the temporary safe location Wyatt arranged. Jacob moved slowly, every step hesitant, every breath measured, as though he wasn't convinced the danger was truly gone. But when he crossed the threshold of the house, something in him eased, just a little. Mike draped a blanket around his shoulders and brought him warm food, sitting beside him without pushing conversation. "You're safe here," Mike saw. "It's softly. Nobody's coming near you." Jacob nodded, eyes lowered. "I don't know how to be normal right now." "You don't have to be normal, just be here." Over the next hours, Jacob's breaths became steadier. His hands shook less. His gaze lifted more often. And for the first time in weeks, when Mike said, "I'm right here," Jacob didn't flinch. A door had opened, not physically, but emotionally. A small, fragile trust beginning to rebuild itself from the ashes. But Hannah wasn't done. That evening, her wrath spilled online. She posted a long, dramatic statement on the church's community page. "My husband has allowed darkness into our home. He has partnered with the enemy to destroy this ministry and attack God's chosen vessels. Pray for Jacob, who has been torn away from essential healing. Stand firm against deception." The post spread quickly through the congregation. Comments poured in, some praising her, some questioning her, some confused. Wyatt saw it, Briggs saw it. Mike saw it too. He didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. He simply sat at the kitchen table, the glow of the screen lighting his face, planning his next move, quietly, strategically, methodically. Because the power had shifted. And Mike wasn't done fighting. Not even close. Detective Briggs didn't waste time. The day after the protective order was served, she walked into Grace Fellowship Church with a small notebook, a calm expression, and the kind of quiet authority that made people talk without being pushed. She requested to speak with members individually, nothing formal yet, just clarifying conversations. But the moment she mentioned Hannah's name, people shifted in their seats. Some avoided her eyes. Some leaned in closer. Some exhaled like they'd been holding something in for months. Briggs began with soft questions. "Have you ever witnessed one of their prayer sessions?" The responses came in fragments at first. A middle-aged woman whispered, "I heard strange things, screaming. Hannah said it was the spirit moving, but it didn't sound holy." Another member said, "Caleb always told us not to question the process. If someone cried, he said it was demons leaving." A young man confessed, "I tried a session once. It wasn't prayer, it was pressure. They told me to scream until I felt release. I left shaking." Briggs wrote everything down. And then one by one, more people stepped forward, tentative, uncertain, but willing to speak. A widower who said Caleb convinced him he was cursed if he didn't submit to weekly deliverance. A teenage girl whose parents forced her into a session and who left feeling violated by fear. A man who admitted he donated money because Caleb said withholding funds invited darkness. The pattern was unmistakable. By the end of the day, Briggs had statements from 7 people, all separately describing the same thing: manipulation dressed as faith. The church began to fracture almost instantly. Some members whispered angrily in the hallways, insisting Caleb was being persecuted, that Hannah was a holy warrior. They reposted Hannah's online statement, accusing Mike of attacking God's movement. But many others rallied behind Briggs. They were tired of the fear-based preaching, tired of the secrecy, tired of watching people break down in the name of deliverance. They formed small clusters outside the building, whispering, "I knew something was wrong, I just didn't know how wrong." A rupture had begun. The ministry that once stood unified now looked like a cracked facade, splitting down the middle. Jacob, meanwhile, had begun attending his first counseling appointment at the Boise Wellness Clinic. Mike sat in the waiting room, flipping through an outdated magazine he wasn't really reading. He could still hear the echoes of Jacob's screams from that night, loud enough to rattle inside him whenever the room felt too quiet. Inside the office, Jacob spoke softly with the therapist, his voice thin but honest. It was the first safe space he'd had in months. But safety didn't last long, because halfway through the session, Hannah showed up. She stormed into the clinic lobby with the urgency of a person who'd convinced herself she was justified, righteous, unstoppable. The receptionist's eyes widened the moment she recognized her. "I need to see Jacob," Hannah said sharply. "He's being deceived. I have to pray over him. He's in danger." Mike shot to his feet. "You need to leave. You're violating the order." Hannah ignored him completely, eyes blazing. "Jacob," she called out toward the hallway. "Jacob, sweetheart, don't let them twist your mind." Two security officers approached fast. "Ma'am, you need to step back." She kept pushing forward. "You're all part of the enemy's plan. He belongs with me. God appointed me to heal him." "Ma'am," the security guard repeated, firmer this time, "you must leave the premises immediately." She twisted, trying to break past them, but they blocked her, guiding her, firmly, professionally, back toward the exit. Her voice echoed through the entire clinic, wild and furious. "This isn't over. He needs me. You can't take him from his calling." When the doors finally closed behind her, the waiting room felt hollow. Mike lowered himself back into his chair, hands trembling for the first time in days. He hadn't realized how deeply he blamed himself until that moment. He whispered under his breath, barely audible, "I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected him sooner." But guilt wasn't the only thing hanging in the air. Because by the next morning, the incident had gone public. A local reporter picked up Hannah's online accusations and the protective order filing. The headline appeared on social media by noon. "Church controversy. Claims of coercive prayer practices spark investigation." Pictures of Hannah outside the clinic. A blurry still of Caleb leaving the station. A quote from an unnamed church member about unusual deliverance rituals. The story spread fast. Suddenly, Mike wasn't just a father fighting inside his home. He was at the center of a community reckoning. And the world had begun to watch. Mike sensed something was coming before he even opened the door. It was early evening, the sun dipping behind the fir trees, casting long shadows across the porch. Jacob was inside resting, finally breathing easier after days of unraveling. Mike stood in the kitchen washing dishes when he heard the gravel crunch on the driveway, slow steps, deliberate, too heavy to be a neighbor. He wiped his hands on a towel and walked to the front door. The moment he opened it, Hannah was there, and beside her, Pastor Caleb. They stood shoulder to shoulder like a united front, the sort of formation predators take before circling prey. Caleb's posture was stiff, chin lifted. Hannah looked unhinged, her hair wild, her eyes darting, mascara streaks down her cheeks as if she'd purposefully let herself appear victimized. "Mike," Hannah sobbed instantly, hands pressed against her chest. "You've taken my son. You've ripped him away from God's healing. You have no right." He didn't move, didn't flinch. "Jacob isn't your son." Caleb stepped forward with a dominating calm. "It's time you stop this foolish rebellion," he said. "Return Jacob to us. He needs deliverance. He is spiritually unfinished." Mike almost laughed at the arrogance of it. "He's not property, Caleb." "He belongs where the Lord is working," Caleb countered, tone cold and rehearsed. "Your interference is harming him." Hannah suddenly collapsed into loud, dramatic sobs. "Mike, please, please don't do this. You're tearing the ministry apart. You're tearing me apart." She reached for Mike's arm, but he stepped back. Her tears didn't move him anymore. Not after what he'd seen. Not after the footage. Caleb's voice sharpened. "If you don't release Jacob voluntarily, we'll take legal action. Religious discrimination, domestic sabotage, emotional manipulation. We'll bury you in court." Mike stared at them both for several long seconds. Long enough for Hannah's crying to soften. Long enough for Caleb to smirk like he'd already won. Then Mike spoke. "Funny you mentioned manipulation." He reached behind the doorframe where he'd tucked his phone earlier that afternoon, prepared, ready, expecting this visit. Without a word, he tapped the screen and pressed play. The audio began quietly, murmurs, footsteps creaking wood. Then Hannah's voice spilled into the air, sharp, instructive, unmistakable. "Breathe faster, Jacob. They need to hear struggle." Hannah froze. Caleb blinked once, expression tightening. Mike didn't stop the playback. "Let it sound like pain. Pain is holy. He must believe you're fighting something dark. It's the only way he'll stop interfering." Caleb's jaw twitched. Hannah took a small step backward, the blood draining from her face. Mike let the audio run a few seconds longer. Jacob's crying, real, aching, desperate, echoed through the porch. The sound shook the air like something alive. Then Mike paused it. Silence fell across all three of them. Hannah's face contorted, not with grief, not with guilt, but with panic. Raw, sudden panic. You stole that," she stammered. "That's illegal, that's—" "No," Mike cut in. "A neighbor recorded it, and the police have the full version." Caleb's mask finally cracked. "You think this proves anything? Audio can be staged. You violated our privacy." "You violated my son," Mike snapped, voice low, steady, lethal. Caleb straightened, clasping his hands behind his back as if regaining composure. "We'll see what the courts think. Expect a lawsuit, a restraining order. We will." "You won't do anything," a voice called from the driveway. All three turned. Detective Briggs walked up the steps, badge visible at her belt, two uniformed officers behind her. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence radiated certainty, the kind that ended arguments and exposed the truth. "Hannah Henson, Pastor Caleb Grant," she said firmly, "you are both being served today." She reached into her folder and pulled out two envelopes, thick, sealed documents. Pending charges include coercive control, financial exploitation, and spiritual abuse under Idaho's vulnerable adult statutes. You will report for formal questioning tomorrow morning. Caleb's face drained of color. "This is a witch hunt." Briggs didn't blink. "No, this is accountability." Hannah stared at the envelope in her hand as if it were on fire. "You can't do this. You don't understand the spiritual realm." Briggs raised a hand. "What I understand is the law, and the law says you both crossed a line." Caleb glared at Briggs, but when one of the officers stepped forward, he finally backed down. "This isn't over," he hissed. Briggs gave a short, cold nod. "You're right, it's just starting." Caleb and Hannah retreated down the steps, slowly at first, then faster, their composure unraveling with every step. As soon as their car pulled away, Mike felt Jacob at his back, standing silently in the doorway. The moment he turned, Jacob stepped forward and practically collapsed into Mike's arms. Mike held him tight, not with desperation this time, not with fear, but with finality. The clash was done, but the war wasn't over yet. The courthouse in downtown Boise had never felt so heavy. Even the marble floors seemed quieter, as if they understood the weight of what was about to unfold inside those walls. Mike walked in beside Jacob and Wyatt, each step deliberate, every breath tight. This wasn't just a hearing. This was the moment the truth finally had a microphone. The courtroom was packed. Church members, reporters, community observers, and people who had never even heard of Caleb until the investigation surfaced online. Some were there to defend him. Some were there because they suspected for years. And some came because they'd lived through their own private nightmares and needed to see someone like Caleb finally held accountable. When Caleb was escorted in, he wore the same calm, saintly expression he'd always worn behind a pulpit. He nodded gently to supporters, placing a hand over his heart with manufactured humility. Hannah sat beside him in a crisp blouse, hair pinned back tightly, her eyes darting around the room like she was calculating every expression, every whisper. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The prosecution started with financial records. A forensic accountant stepped forward, detailing transaction after transaction. Donations Caleb funneled through personal accounts, payments from members funneled directly to him rather than the church, unexplained withdrawals labeled as deliverance offerings. The accountant's voice was steady as he concluded. These patterns directly match the markers of spiritual and financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. Caleb shifted in his seat for the first time. Then came the testimonies. One by one, members of the congregation stepped up. A young woman described being pressured into deliverance screaming sessions she couldn't escape. A widower explained paying thousands over 3 years because Caleb claimed it was the only way to lift the curse his late wife had left behind. A teenager recounted hyperventilating, while Caleb shouted prayers inches from her face. Mike watched Caleb's face tighten with every statement, the cracks showing beneath the mask, the calm facade slipping. Then came Hannah's turn. The prosecutor revealed the forged signatures, documents she manipulated to gain access to Jacob's accounts. Copies of withdrawal slips surfaced, handwritten notes in her script claiming holy authorization. Phone records showed late-night calls to Caleb, coordinating sessions and isolations under the guise of prayer. Hannah tried to interrupt. Those signatures, Jacob gave me permission. But the prosecutor held up the original forms. He did not sign these versions. You forged them. The courtroom rustled, shocked whispers, gasps, heads turning toward Hannah with disbelief and disgust. Her jaw trembled, fury shaking through each breath as she glared toward Jacob as though betrayal were his crime rather than hers. Caleb was next to testify. He denied everything, every scream, every staged reaction, every manipulation, every financial scheme. His voice remained steady, rehearsed. I have dedicated my life to God. These attacks come from spiritual blindness. Everything done was for healing. The prosecutor pressed play on the video evidence. Caleb's own voice filled the courtroom. Show fear, don't hold back. Your father must believe you're fighting something dark. A second clip followed, Jacob trembling on the floor, sobbing as Hannah's voice hissed commands at him like threats disguised as spiritual urgency. The courtroom fell silent, not a cough, not a murmur. Even the judge's expression shifted into something unmistakable, horror. Caleb's defense evaporated in seconds. And still, Hannah tried one last tactic. She took the stand, her voice quivering as she portrayed Jacob as mentally unstable, fragile, easily influenced, claiming he was suffering from delusions and emotional dependence. She painted herself as a caring stepmother cornered by Mike's hostility, arguing that she only intervened because Jacob needed spiritual structure. Hannah even cried, loudly, dramatically, wiping tears that left no sea of moisture behind. But the prosecution called Jacob's therapist. A calm, steady woman. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply stated facts. Jacob is not unstable. What you hear in his voice is trauma. Trauma directly linked to coercive practices disguised as spiritual deliverance. Hannah's expression fell apart. Finally, the judge allowed Jacob to speak. He stood slowly, shoulders straight, jaw trembling, but eyes clear. For the first time in months, he looked like himself. Older, bruised in spirit but present. "My father saved my life," he began. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. "I thought I was broken. I thought something was wrong with me. They told me I was spiritually sick, that I needed pain to heal, but it wasn't healing, it was control." His hands shook, Mike's heart clenched. "And my dad, he never stopped trying to get to me, even when I pushed him away. Even when I was scared of everything, he didn't stop." Mike didn't try to hide the tears in his eyes. Not today. Jacob faced Caleb and Hannah directly. "You didn't help me. You hurt me." The courtroom held its breath. He stepped back, voice softer but steadier. "I want this to end." And in that moment, silence hanging like a verdict, the truth finally stood tall enough for everyone to see. The courthouse air felt different on the morning of sentencing, thicker, heavier, charged with the unspoken expectation that something final, something irreversible was about to happen. Mike sat beside Jacob in the second row. Jacob's breathing was slow but steady, his fingers loosely intertwined with his father's, as if grounding himself through touch alone. Caleb and Hannah were escorted in separately. Caleb walked with the confidence of a man certain he could still manipulate the room. Hannah looked wild, hair disheveled, lips pressed tight, eyes darting with the frantic energy of someone losing grip on the world she controlled. But neither of them were prepared for what the prosecution revealed next. The state attorney stepped forward. "Your Honor, before sentencing, new evidence has come to light." The room went still. Mike leaned forward instinctively. Jacob did too, the tension returning to his shoulders. The attorney lifted a USB drive. "This was submitted anonymously last night. It contains a recording, audio captured by Pastor Grant himself." Caleb's head snapped up. Hannah's face drained of color. The judge gestured, "Proceed." The attorney clicked play. A grainy recording filled the courtroom. Caleb's voice came first, calm, calculating. "Are you sure this is how far you want to take it?" And then Hannah, clear, cold, chillingly casual. "Yes, once Jacob is admitted, they'll give me full access to manage his affairs. You know the paperwork. Once Mike passes, I inherit everything anyway." A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. Someone gasped. Someone whispered, "My God." But Hannah's voice kept going. "Jacob trusts me more when he's scared. The institution will accept my statement. They always do. After that, it's just patience." Caleb responded quietly, "And Mike, he'll fight." Hannah laughed, a small, sinister sound. "Not for long. He's old, Caleb. His time is coming. Once Jacob's under my authority and Mike's gone, everything falls into place." Mike felt the world tilt beneath him, an icy wave rolling through his chest as each word landed like a blade. He stared ahead, jaw clenched, eyes burning. She didn't just want control. She didn't just want obedience. She wanted their lives, one institutionalized, one dead. He felt Jacob tense beside him, then begin to shake. Jacob's fingers dug into Mike's arm, his breath turning hollow. "Dad, she." "I know," Mike whispered, voice cracking. "I know." Hannah shot to her feet, screaming over the recording. "That was taken out of context. You don't understand. I—" "Sit down, Mrs. Henson," the judge ordered. But she didn't. She spun toward Caleb with feral fury. "You recorded me. You snake, you set me up." Caleb's mask finally broke. He looked stunned, caught between self-preservation and indignation. But before he could speak, the judge slammed the gavel. "Order." The attorney paused the audio. "Your Honor," he said, "this recording clearly reveals premeditated intent to institutionalize an adult capable of making his own decisions, financial motive behind that plan, and anticipated benefit from Mr. Henson's eventual passing. These are not spiritual actions. These are criminal." Caleb stood abruptly. "I only recorded it to protect myself. She was going too far. The judge cut him off. "Enough, Pastor Grant." For once, Caleb fell silent. Hannah collapsed into her chair, chest heaving, hands trembling violently. Her tears were no longer calculated. They were the tears of someone watching the tower of her control topple in real time. The judge reviewed the notes in front of her, removed her glasses, and spoke with a tone that left no room for ambiguity. "Pastor Caleb Grant, why? Our actions demonstrate manipulation, coercion, and calculated financial predation of vulnerable adults under the guise of religious authority. You knowingly contributed to psychological abuse. You are hereby sentenced to a long-term custodial sentence." The number that followed made Caleb's shoulders drop. Whatever remained of his authority dissolved with it. Then came Hannah. "Mrs. Hannah Henson," the judge continued, "you engaged in forgery, coercive control, psychological abuse, attempted financial fraud, and the planning of involuntary institutionalization of your stepson for personal gain." Hannah shook her head violently. "No, no, you can't do this. You can't, Mike. Tell them. Tell them I helped Jacob. Tell them." Mike didn't look at her. Not once. Jacob flinched when she screamed his name. "Jacob, Jacob, tell them I tried to save you. Tell them." Security stepped closer. Hannah's voice rose into a shriek, raw, cracking, desperate. "Mike, this is your fault. You destroyed us. You destroyed everything." The judge continued speaking over her. "You will serve consecutive sentences for each proven count." The final gavel strike sounded like closure snapping into place. But the room wasn't quiet. Hannah lunged toward Mike, restrained immediately by deputies as she screamed, "You were mine to fix. Both of you were mine." Jacob covered his ears, folding in on himself at the sound. Mike turned instantly, pulling him into his arms, holding him tight, steady, safe. Jacob broke. Completely. Sobs tore through him as he clung to his father, shaking as if his body was releasing months of fear all at once. "Dad, it's over," Jacob cried into his shoulder. "It's finally over." Mike held him, eyes burning, heart aching, not just from relief, but from the crushing realization of how close he came to losing his son. And as the courtroom murmured, as Hannah was dragged out screaming, as Caleb stared blankly at the floor, everyone saw the truth. Not religious warfare. Not deliverance. Not healing. Just a father who fought. And a son finally free. Jacob moved back home 2 days after the sentencing. Not permanently, at least that's what he kept telling himself, but just until he felt steady on his feet again. When he stepped through the front door, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he paused as if waiting for some echo of the past to greet him. There was none, just the quiet hum of a house finally free from shadows. Mike didn't hover, he didn't fuss, he simply nodded toward the guest room. "Sheets are clean, closets empty. Take whatever time you need, son." Jacob nodded, his shoulders eased barely, but enough for Mike to see the small shift, a beginning. The first few mornings were quiet. Jacob moved slowly as if relearning how to walk through a home without fear of someone's voice rising behind him. Mike kept things simple. Breakfast scrambled eggs, a mug of tea instead of coffee. No pressure, no questions pushed too hard. They talked about small things, whether the news, a broken sprinkler head outside. It wasn't much, but it was something normal, and normal felt like healing. By the end of the first week, Mike introduced structure. A routine. Gentle, steady anchors for Jacob's day. "Morning walk with me," he said one sunrise, handing Jacob a light jacket. "Only 10 minutes." Jacob agreed, hesitantly at first, but the crisp air, the sound of gravel under their feet, the quiet rhythm of their steps, it did something inside him, a small loosening, a reminder that his body wasn't tied to fear anymore. After the walk, therapy. Jacob's therapist, a calm, patient woman with warm eyes, became his center of gravity. He went 3 times a week. Some days he sat in silence. Other days, the words poured out of him like something bursting through a broken dam. Mike waited in the lobby every time, reading the same sports magazine over and over, pretending he wasn't listening for Jacob's footsteps at the end of each session. One day, Jacob came out with his shoulders back a little straighter. Another day, he came out crying. Another, he came out almost smiling. Healing wasn't linear, but it was happening. One Friday afternoon, after a particularly heavy session, Mike surprised Jacob with 2 fishing poles propped by the front door. Jacob blinked. "We haven't gone fishing in years." "I know," Mike said, grabbing his truck keys. "Figured we're overdue." They drove to the old river bend where Mike used to take him when he was a kid, a quiet patch layered with pine needles and memories of simpler times. The water flowed softly, the sunlight flickering across its surface like scattered coins. Jacob cast his line awkwardly at first, the motion rusty. Mike didn't comment. He just cast his own line and waited. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Jacob sighed, the kind of sigh that carried more weight than words. "Dad, I forgot what calm feels like." Mike nodded, eyes on the water. "Takes time, but it comes back." Jacob swallowed. "I did. Think it would." "You're here," Mike said gently. "That's the first step." Slowly, inch by inch, the corners of Jacob's mouth lifted, not fully into a smile, but into the shadow of one. And for Mike, that shadow was brighter than any sunrise. Meanwhile, Wyatt worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He spent hours combing through Jacob's accounts, reversing unauthorized transfers, closing fraudulent access points Hannah had created, securing everything behind new legal protections. One evening, he came by the house with a folder thick with paperwork. "It's done," Wyatt said. "Every transaction reversed, every document nullified. Caleb's financial ties are severed. Hannah's claims are void." Jacob exhaled a shaky breath. "So, it's really over." "As over as it can be," Wyatt replied. "And what's left, we handle it together." Jacob nodded, his eyes meeting Wyatt's with gratitude that words couldn't hold. After Wyatt left, Jacob sat beside Mike on the couch, staring at nothing in particular. "It feels strange," he said quietly, "like my mind is a house someone else lived in for too long." Mike rested a hand on his shoulder. "We'll furnish it again, piece by piece." Days turned into weeks. The house transformed in small but meaningful ways. Jacob started helping with the garden, pulling weeds with a focus that soothed him. He returned to cooking, experimenting with simple meals. Some evenings, he and Mike watched old westerns on TV, movies Mike had forgotten he owned. The fear didn't disappear overnight. Sometimes Jacob woke from nightmares. Sometimes he flinched at sudden noises. Sometimes he questioned whether he was strong enough to keep moving forward. But each time Mike sat with him, breathed with him, reminded him he wasn't alone. One night, as they sat quietly watching the embers fade in the fireplace, Jacob turned to Mike. "Dad," he said softly, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Mike replied. "Just keep healing." Jacob nodded, eyes shining. "I'm trying." "I know." For the first time in months, the house felt like a home again. Not a battleground, not a maze of fear and manipulation. A home. And as the evening settled into peaceful silence, Mike realized something he hadn't felt in a long time. Calmness. Not temporary. Not fragile. Real. Peace was returning, slowly, carefully, but undeniably. And for the first time, the future didn't look dark. It looked possible. Mike had always believed that walking could fix almost anything. Not the world's problems, not trauma or grief, but the knots inside a man's chest. The kind that tightened quietly, the kind that built over months of worry and fear. So in the weeks following the sentencing, he returned to the Boise River trails he'd walked for decades. The path curved along the water, lined with cottonwoods and soft dirt, and the river's steady push felt like the world insisting, gently, that life kept moving. Mike walked slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, breathing in the crisp morning air. The sun was still low, casting gold across the rippling surface. He didn't rush the walks. They weren't exercise, they were release. Every few minutes, something inside him whispered, "You almost lost him." Another voice whispered back, "But you didn't." Back home, Jacob sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea from the same mug he used as a teenager. When Mike walked in, Jacob looked up, offering a small, hesitant smile. "You were out early again," Jacob said. "Needed some fresh air," Mike replied, hanging his jacket. Jacob set the mug down, fingers tracing the rim. "Dad, I've been meaning to say something." Mike pulled out the chair across from him and sat slowly. "What's on your mind?" "You didn't give up on me," Jacob said. His voice wasn't trembling, but it was thick with emotion. "Even when I was lost, even when I thought you were the enemy, even when everyone believed their lies, you kept fighting." Mike's eyes softened, though something painful flickered behind them. "You're my son. I'd walk through fire for you." Jacob lowered his gaze, twisting the mug in his hands. "I don't know if I would have made it out without you." Mike inhaled slowly, the memory of Jacob's shaking body on that bedroom floor still sharp enough to sting. "I should have seen it sooner," he admitted quietly. "I should have known she was manipulating you. I ignored signs because I thought she was just strict about faith. I thought she cared." Jacob shook his head firmly. "Dad, you couldn't have known. They were good at hiding it. I didn't even see it until it was too late." Mike exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Still, a father's supposed to know, and I didn't." Jacob reached across the table, touching Mike's forearm gently. "You did when it mattered." The room fell into a warm silence, one that didn't demand anything, didn't pressure either of them. Just two men, healing in the aftershock of something that nearly destroyed them both. Lydia stopped by that afternoon with her usual knock, quiet, polite, but unmistakable. She carried a plate of lemon bars and wore a sweater patterned with cardinals. "I figured you two haven't been eating enough," she said, stepping inside. Mike smirked. "We're eating fine." "Not my kind of fine," she replied, lifting the plate as if it were evidence. Jacob laughed softly, a sound that had been rare for too long. Lydia beamed at him, patting his shoulder. "Good to see color back in your face." Jacob smiled shyly. "Thanks, Lydia, for everything. You didn't have to record anything, but you did." Her expression softened. "Honey, when something feels wrong, you don't wait for someone else to fix it. You act. Your dad would have done the same if it were my hallway." Jacob nodded, and Mike realized, quietly, that Lydia had become more than a neighbor. She'd become a steady presence, a small piece of light in a dark chapter. Later that week, Briggs stopped by the house for a follow-up. She stood on the porch with her notepad tucked under one arm. "More victims came forward," she informed Mike. 3 additional statements, one from a man Caleb trained under, 2 from women pressured into repentance rituals. Some of it goes back years. Mike shook his head slowly. How did he hide it for so long? "People like him choose victims who are isolated, grieving, scared, people looking for hope," Briggs said. "He didn't fool you. He groomed the community." Mike swallowed, looking toward Jacob through the window. "He almost ruined my boy." Briggs's voice softened. "But he didn't, and because of your persistence, a lot of people are getting closure." She slipped a card into Mike's hand. "If you or Jacob ever need anything, official or not, you call me." Mike nodded, "Thank you." Briggs turned to leave but paused. "For what it's worth, you're a hell of a father." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply said, "I'm trying." 2 weeks later, Mike did something he never expected. He started volunteering at a small mental health center across town, an unassuming building with beige walls and too many coffee-stained chairs. He helped with simple things, organizing pamphlets, driving clients to appointments, fixing the broken light in the lobby. But he also listened, really listened, when people came in shaking, lost, fragile. He didn't share his story. He didn't need to. Sometimes, understanding didn't require words. One afternoon, after driving home from the center, he walked into the house to find Jacob sitting in the living room, sketching quietly, a hobby he'd abandoned long before Hannah's control began. Mike watched him for a moment, leaning against the doorway, letting the sight sink in. Color was returning to Jacob's life, and color was slowly returning to his. Jacob glanced up. "Dad, everything okay?" Mike smiled, small but genuine. "Yeah, everything's starting to be." Jacob nodded, a peacefulness settling in his eyes. "Feels like it." And for the first time, neither of them needed to say anything more. Closure wasn't here yet, but it was forming. Quietly, patiently, steadily. Jacob's life didn't snap back into place overnight, but it did start to rebuild in small, steady steps. Steps Mike watched with the same quiet pride a father feels when his child relearns their footing after a long fall. The biggest shift came on a Wednesday morning when Jacob walked into the kitchen holding a folded piece of paper and wearing a smile that wasn't forced, wasn't shaky, wasn't borrowed from someone else's expectation. "Dad," he said, sliding the paper across the table, "I got the job." Mike unfolded it. A simple offer letter from a local outdoor supply store, part-time to start, flexible hours, room to grow. But to Mike, it felt like a doorway. "I knew you'd get it," he said, voice warm, certain. For weeks, Jacob had been looking for something quiet, manageable, a place where no one raised their voice or pretended spiritual power made them superior. The store manager had liked his calm demeanor and patience with customers. "You've got a steady presence," he'd said. Jacob hadn't heard those words in years. Independence, real independence, was returning. While Jacob rebuilt the outward pieces of his life, Mike worked quietly on the structural ones. He met with Wyatt 3 more times, each session dissolving more of Hannah's leftover influence. Protective legal documents, permanent boundaries, future safeguards. Wyatt went through everything with a fine-tooth comb, closing old accounts, securing new ones, eliminating any possible loophole Hannah or anyone like her could ever exploit again. When they finished, Wyatt leaned back in his chair. "She won't have access to anything ever again, and neither will anyone claiming spiritual authority. You're protected. Jacob's protected." Mike let out a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Thank you." This time, unlike the past, the legal walls were strong, intentional, unbreakable. But even with safety restored, the past tried reaching for them. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mailbox. Mike recognized the handwriting instantly, sharp loops, perfect angles, the same script she'd used in all the documents she forged. "Hannah." He didn't open it, didn't even bring it inside. He walked straight to the trash bin, lifted the lid and dropped the envelope in without hesitation. No second guessing, no curiosity, no pause. Some doors don't deserve reopening. Some words don't deserve space in a healed home. Jacob asked later, "Was there mail?" "Nothing important," Mike answered, and he meant it. Caleb's followers, once loud and righteous online, grew silent with each passing week. A few deleted their posts. A few offered weak apologies. Most simply vanished from the conversation entirely, slipping back into their routines as if they had never defended him in the first place. The church itself fractured, some members choosing new congregations, some leaving organized religion altogether, some quietly reflecting on how they'd been misled. But what mattered most to Mike and Jacob was that the noise was gone. The pressure, the judgment, the eyes that once stared at them like they were enemies of faith, gone. Their world grew quieter, and quieter meant peace. One evening, Jacob stood in the doorway of the living room, shifting his weight nervously. Mike muted the TV. "What's up?" Jacob inhaled. "I've been thinking about something. I found an apartment. It's small, nothing fancy, but it's close to work. And I think I'm ready to live on my own again." Mike's chest tightened, not with fear but with the bittersweet ache every parent knows. "You sure?" Jacob nodded. "Yeah, I don't want to run from this house. I don't feel trapped here anymore, but I need to try standing on my own." And he paused, looking at Mike with softened eyes. "I wouldn't be here without you." Mike swallowed, emotion catching in his throat. "Then I'll help you move, whatever you need." Jacob smiled, an actual unguarded smile. "Thanks, Dad." They talked about furniture, about rent, about little things like pots and towels, and the best time to call the utility company. Normal things, regular things, things that meant the shadows had moved out and the light had finally taken their place. That night after Jacob went to bed, Mike stepped onto the porch and breathed in the cool Idaho air. The sky was clear, stars sharp, the world finally still. Jacob was reclaiming his life. Mike was reclaiming his peace. And for the first time in months, neither of them felt watched, judged, or hunted. They were free. And breathing, finally breathing, was easy again. Christmas arrived quietly that year. No loud decorations, no chaotic gatherings, no strained laughter masking tension. Just a gentle snowfall over Boise, a simple wreath on Mike's front door, and a small tree glowing softly in the living room. For the first time in years, the holiday didn't feel like something he had to survive. It felt peaceful. Mike stood by the kitchen counter, pouring hot chocolate into two mismatched mugs. The house smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon, the kind of scent he used to associate with better times. Now, it felt like a fresh start. He glanced toward the living room where Jacob was adjusting an ornament, stepping back, considering its placement, then moving it half an inch to the left. "Normal things. Gentle things. Life things. You're fussing with that ornament like it owes you money," Mike said with a small smirk. Jacob chuckled, an unburdened, natural laugh. "Just trying to make it look right." Mike handed him a mug. "It already does." They sat for a moment just sipping quietly, the soft hum of holiday music filling the background. Jacob seemed lighter this season, still healing, still careful with himself, but no longer weighed down by invisible chains. His eyes were clearer, his posture relaxed, his mind his own again. "Dad," Jacob said suddenly, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I got you something." Mike blinked. "We said no gifts." "It's small but important." Jacob handed him a flat, wrapped object. Mike unfolded the paper slowly, revealing a simple wooden picture frame. Inside was a handwritten note in Jacob's familiar script. "Thank you for hearing me." Mike stared at it, not speaking, not breathing. Because those four words carried everything. The cries he once couldn't reach, the fear he couldn't erase, the nights Mike pounded on a locked door praying his son wouldn't break beyond repair. They carried guilt, love, relief, and a bond reforged through fire. His eyes burned before he ever felt the tears escape. He swallowed hard, clearing his throat, but the emotion tightened anyway. Jacob's voice softened. "Dad, you listened, when no one else did, when even I couldn't speak for myself." Mike brushed a thumb over the frame, inhaling shakily. "You don't owe me thanks, Jacob, I just—" "No," Jacob said firmly, "I do." There was no heaviness in his voice, just truth. Mike nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. He placed the frame gently on the mantel. A knock sounded at the door, breaking the moment. Mike wiped his eyes subtly before opening it. Lydia stood there, bundled in a red scarf, holding a plate wrapped in foil. "Merry Christmas, boys," she said with a grin. "And before you ask, yes, they're cookies. And yes, you're both eating them." Mike chuckled. "You didn't have to bring anything." "I know," she said, stepping inside. "But I figured Mike needed something festive. Otherwise, he'll pretend he's not a softie." Jacob burst out laughing, and even Mike cracked a smile. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Sure you are," Lydia teased, tapping the frame on the mantel with her free hand. "Softy." Jacob leaned back on the couch, still smiling. "She's not wrong." Mike rolled his eyes, but his heart felt full. Full in a way it hadn't felt since his wife passed years earlier. Lydia stayed just long enough to share cookies, warmth, and her usual dry humor before heading home to her own quiet evening. As the door shut behind her, the house settled again, soft, warm, dense, with the kind of peace that comes after surviving a storm. Mike and Jacob moved to the fireplace, the flames crackling gently. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. Healing sometimes sounds like silence. Sometimes it looks like two people sitting shoulder to shoulder, watching embers glow brighter than the shadows that once filled their lives. Jacob leaned back in his chair. "Dad, this is the first Christmas in a long time where I'm not scared." Mike looked at him, really looked at him. "Me too." The fire crackled, snow fell outside, and for once nothing felt rushed, nothing felt forced, nothing felt haunted. Healing didn't just feel possible tonight. It felt real. The house was quiet that morning, quiet in a way it hadn't been in a long time. The kind of quiet that wasn't thick with dread or filled with footsteps pacing upstairs or split open by screams and commands disguised as prayer. Just quiet. Mike stood at the foot of the hallway, staring at the door to the room that had once been called the prayer room. The wood still bore faint dents from the night he'd broken it open, from the night everything shattered and everything began. He hadn't stepped inside since. He reached for the doorknob, inhaled deeply, and pushed it open. The room was empty now, completely cleared out. The furniture was gone. The rug with the dark stains had been ripped up. Even the heavy curtains Hannah insisted on keeping drawn were replaced with soft white ones that let the morning light spill in freely. But emptiness doesn't erase memory. The moment Mike entered, the echoes came back. Jacob's cries, raw, frantic, terrified. Hannah's voice, sharp and commanding. Caleb's calm instructions, chilling in their false holiness. The thuds, the pleading, the whispered threats. He closed his eyes, feeling his chest tighten, the air growing heavier around him. The room looked harmless now, but he knew walls remember things, floors remember things, fathers remember things most of all. He walked to the center of the room and stood still, letting the memories rise and settle, not forcing them away. Then he whispered, "Your prayer wasn't prayer, it was control." The words didn't echo. They settled softly, like dust finally allowed to fall. Behind him, footsteps approached slowly. Jacob leaned against the doorway, arms folded gently across his chest, watching his father with quiet understanding. "You okay?" Jacob asked, voice soft. Mike nodded once. "Yeah, just needed to face it." Jacob took a step inside, his shoes brushing the newly cleaned floor. "It feels different now," he said, "like it's finally ours again." Mike studied him, the steadier breathing, the grounded posture, the eyes that no longer darted toward imaginary threats. Healing had taken hold in him, rooting itself deeper each day. But the scars, invisible as they were, lived here, in this room most of all. Jacob moved closer. "Dad, I never said it enough. Thank you for rescuing me, for not giving up, for fighting when I couldn't." Mike swallowed hard, emotions tightening in his throat. "I'll always fight for you." Jacob nodded, but there was something deeper behind his eyes, something he needed the answer to, even now. "Why didn't you speak out sooner?" Jacob asked quietly. Back when you first suspected something, when you heard the sounds, when things felt wrong. Mike took a slow breath, the weight of the question settling like a stone. He looked around the empty room once before answering. Because speaking too soon, he said, voice low and steady, would have destroyed the proof. Jacob blinked, absorbing the words. Mike continued, turning toward him fully. If I'd accused her without evidence, she would have spun it against me. She was good at that. Caleb was even better. They would have buried the truth, turned you against me even more. I had to wait. I had to be sure. I had to make it undeniable. Jacob's eyes glistened, not with sadness this time, but with understanding, real understanding. So your silence wasn't fear. Mike shook his head. No, it was strategy, and it's the only reason we could stop them. Jacob let out a breath he'd been holding for years. He stepped closer, and Mike rested a hand on his shoulder. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply stood together in the room that had once broken them, now reclaiming it piece by piece. Finally, Mike nodded toward the hallway. Come on, he said gently. Let's go, nothing left for us in here. Jacob took one last look around, then followed his father out. When they stepped into the hallway, Mike shut the door, not angrily, not with force, but with quiet finality. A door that once trapped Jacob had become a door they chose to leave behind. As they walked toward the living room, sunlight stretched across the floorboards, warm and open. Mike exhaled and spoke the final truth that had carried him through every phase of their fight. Silence wasn't surrender, it was the beginning of justice.